Welcome, everyone. Today, we're going to be learning about responsive web design. So for those of you who haven't heard of this, I'm sorry, did someone ask something? No? Okay. So for those of you who are not familiar with this concept, responsive web design is an approach to building websites where the website responds to various aspects of the user's device to show them a more appropriate version of the website. So most commonly, a responsive website needs to adapt to the width of a user's device to show a version of the website that fits in the screen. So aside from the screen size, a responsive website should also be usable across different devices with different capabilities, such as touchscreens, mouse and keyboard, or browsers that don't use JavaScript. But by and large, we're mostly going to be concerned with the width of the device. So for the most part, what I'm going to be talking about today is building websites that can respond to different size screens. But we can slice this up a little more finely. There are generally two different approaches to responsive web design. The first one is called progressive enhancement. So with this style of responsive web design, you primarily design for the smallest, most limited devices, which would be a touchscreen without a mouse and keyboard. And then you gradually add non-essential features for larger screens. So to get an example of that really quick, let's take a look at LinkedIn. So hopefully this website is familiar to many of you. Now, before I actually dive in here, I want to say something real quick. This is not my real LinkedIn account. I made this LinkedIn account like with my work email just for giving this demo, basically, so I could show you a LinkedIn account because they need to be logged in. If you want to add me to LinkedIn, that's totally cool. Don't add this account because I don't check it. I don't update my profile or whatever. It doesn't look like a real person. I do have a real LinkedIn account connected to my actual email address that you might prefer to add. But this is not like a real LinkedIn account, just to be clear. But anyways, so let's look at what happens as the screen gets smaller. So we already kind of know what the screen looks like when it's big, but we're going to see as the screen gets smaller how non-essential features are going to get removed from the screen, and we're left with only the bare bones basic functionality that makes this page work. So slowly squeezing it in. Right now, we're just seeing the margins kind of get a little bit smaller. It's not really affecting the layout at all. So here, we finally see a shift in the layout. It doesn't look like it removes any content, but it does, change the layout. This is a breakpoint, we call it, a specific width in pixels where the layout changes. So, a whole bunch of margins and padding just change all of a sudden in order to accommodate this smaller screen size. Let me just define that real quick. Point. So we're going to keep squeezing this in here a little bit. So now at this breakpoint, you notice the nav bar changes. So at the smallest size, we don't even have a search bar. It's a search button, and you have to click it in order to see the search bar. So some people might think that that's not quite as good as just having the search bar there all the time. This is much more clear that it's searchable because I can recognize the search bar really easily. If it's smaller and it's just the icon, I have to, look at it and see that it's an icon. I have to read it. I don't actually know if this is going to let me search on this page or take me to a new page, so it's less clear what happens when I click on it. So this search feature is enhanced at a larger screen. It doesn't break at a smaller screen. The search feature still works. It's just slightly enhanced at the larger screen. When I go down even smaller, we can see that this whole sidebar on the right disappears. So it's nice that the ad goes away, but the LinkedIn news also disappears. That's just completely gone. Apparently that was decided to be a non-essential widget. So for the smaller screen sizes, just showing you the most essential functionality, it doesn't have that LinkedIn news widget. But at the bigger screen sizes, they wanted to, progressively enhance this page. So they're like, oh, what's a little extra value we can add, something useful we can put on here. So they put this little news stories widget. Honestly, I feel really bad for whatever engineer had to build this thing, because I'm sure they put a lot of time and effort into making it work, but most users are not going to see it because they're going to be looking at LinkedIn on their phone or a tablet or whatever. And just CSS is hiding all of their hard work. But such is life as a developer. So as we squeeze this in even more, we notice some other changes to the nav bar. At some point, not all of these buttons are going to fit. So they change the icon style. Now there's a few different, there's 3 different ways you can present nav bar icons, in my opinion. You can have just the text, which is the most clear, but it's the slowest to read. You can have just icons, which is the least clear because you have to kind of know what the icons mean, but it's the fastest to read because if you can recognize the icons, you can probably recognize, a magnifying glass icon faster than you can read the word search. And then the compromise between those is what you see here, using the icons and the label, but that takes up the most space. So at a bigger layout, it makes sense that we're going to have an icon that is fast to recognize and easy to read, but takes up more space because we have more space. But for smaller screen sizes, LinkedIn has decided to get rid of the text labels and just have the icons. But we still have this ad here. That's something I think is interesting, is that for all the compromises that LinkedIn is going to take in their layout, this ad is one of the last things to go. So at this screen size, we get this little sidebar that disappears. Now we're getting more into phone style layouts. Generally for phones, you don't have any kind of sidebar, just everything stacks vertically. Squeeze in a little more. And then finally, at this screen size, this is their last breakpoint, where we actually don't have that ad anymore. We get this little ... for extra menu items. Click on that, and then the 2 missing items are here. So this, I would say, is an example of progressive enhancement, because this entire website is functional at the very smallest screen size. I can do everything on LinkedIn that I need to do at this very small screen size. But if I do have more screen space, LinkedIn is going to progressively enhance this page to make it a little bit more useful or informative. So that is progressive enhancement. Justin, did you have a question before?
I figured it out.
Congratulations.
Thanks.
Jake, did you have a question?
So the when you switch from a desktop view to a mobile view, it literally only has to worry about the width of your browser. I just always thought that like if you were on mobile, then the browser could tell, and that like it would show you a whole different web page, but that's not the case, is it?
So that's an interesting question.
It's a great question.
Oh wow, it doesn't even exist anymore. Geez. So it used to be a much more common practice that this was more when like smartphones were new, but kind of before tablets were popular. It used to be common practice that people would build a just separate version of a website.
Yeah, I remember it'd be like view mobile version or something.
So like there used to be m.wikipedia.org, which was the mobile Wikipedia site. And so if you went there, or if Wikipedia just detected that you were using a phone, it would redirect you to the mobile version. But that had a variety of problems. So for one thing, like someone's going to a specific website and then you redirect them to another website. Like I might have been looking for I don't know. So okay, I'm looking for Albert Einstein. The URL is /wiki/Albert Einstein. But what some websites would do is just redirect me to m.wikipedia.org, forgetting the specific page I was looking for. So that would get really frustrating. You know, just getting redirected back to the home page, the entrance, when you tried to link to something specific. But also it creates problems because, well, A, you have two separate websites to maintain. Instead of building one website, you're now building two websites. So in some ways, that's twice as much effort for your front-end developers. But also as tablets became more popular, it was less reasonable to just design two different websites, but you needed, you know, maybe like 8 different websites for all of the kind of middle-sized devices that are bigger than phones, smaller than laptops. So because we're not just building 2 different websites for 2 different sized devices, but we're trying to accommodate a range of different sizes, like any width device should look reasonable. We no longer build those mobile specific websites. So instead, with the techniques I'm going to show you today, we're going to learn how to make more dynamic websites that can adjust more fluidly to, you know, different screen widths, basically. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. I just didn't think like, I mean, just with, it just seems so simple, like, but
It is
makes
very
sense.
simple. So figure for one thing, all websites are too tall for the device you view them on. Whether it's a phone or a laptop or anything, you're going to have to scroll vertically for any website. That's just how the web works, basically. So the fact that a phone is much shorter than a laptop doesn't matter because both of them are much shorter than any website. The most meaningful difference between them is just the width of the screen. And
Oh,
like,
that makes sense.
touch versus click is also a meaningful difference, I guess. But really all that means is don't depend on hover states in your application. So sometimes it's nice, like, you know, this gets underlined, so I know where my mouse is, but you shouldn't depend on this. Your application shouldn't break without hover states because mobile users can't hover on things because they don't have a mouse. I guess you also have to bear in mind that like there's the on-screen keyboard for mobile users. So in order for me to type in this text box, a keyboard has to come up that's going to block out the bottom half of my screen. So you have to keep that in mind if you want a user to type while looking at something else on their screen. Bear in mind that a mobile user is going to have a hard time looking at other things on the screen while they're typing. That's actually a specific bug that I've seen in like products that I've built and used, that it was inaccessible to mobile users because the on-screen keyboard was covering up important features. But for the most part, all you really need to care about is width. And also, as far as like learning new CSS properties, we're going to learn new CSS properties to respond to the width. Whereas there isn't as much new CSS that I'm going to teach you for, you know, touch versus hover. It's just kind of conceptually don't depend on hover. Or I'm sorry, click versus hover. Anyways, so moving on. The next approach to responsive web design I want to talk about is graceful degradation. So this is the opposite of progressive enhancement. You design a website for the largest, most capable devices, and then gracefully remove features for devices that can't handle them. Now, ideally, removed features are replaced with an alternative, so the site is still useful, or at least the user should be informed that their browser doesn't support the required feature. So one simple example of graceful degradation would be the NoScript tag, which only renders on the screen for users that don't run JavaScript. Now, ideally, this element should be used to display a plain text version of your website for users that don't have JavaScript enabled. But more commonly, this tag is just used to tell users that the website won't work without JavaScript. So get an example of that real quick. I'm going to make an HTML file here. All right, I will open up my terminal, launch a web server to view this. Cool. So we can see welcome to the internet. My H1 is rendering, but the NoScript is not rendering. It doesn't take up space on the page at all. It just doesn't exist on the screen. It's only technically in the HTML. But that's because I have JavaScript enabled. So what if I didn't? Where's that? Here we go. Disable JavaScript. So now I get to experience the internet as if it was like the early 90s or whatever. There's no JavaScript, it's just HTML and CSS. So now I refresh the page and we can see that I need to enable JavaScript in order to use this web page. So that's probably the very simplest example I can think of graceful degradation. Without JavaScript, we can just warn the user that they need JavaScript. So I do stuff like this for like some of my projects because I like making just wacky interactive audiovisual stuff. Sometimes like music applications using MIDI devices. And of course, like a requirement for that is that you need to have a MIDI device plugged into your computer because that's like the main interface through which you drive the application. So if you're trying to use the app with just like a mouse and keyboard or a touch device, I kind of have to tell the user, like, you can't use this application. It requires, a piano keyboard in order to work.
How did you get to this menu again?
So in the inspector in DevTools, you click this little gear in the top right, and it takes you to this preferences menu. And then it's all the way in the bottom, debugger, disable JavaScript.
Thank you.
Yeah, there are definitely a lot of menus here in DevTools. It gets kind of messy. Like there's this gear menu, all that stuff. There's this like ... which is a different menu. I think they actually changed the layout of DevTools. Oh wait, here is what I was thinking about. So in the console, I extra hate this because you've got the gear menu up here, and then there's this other gear menu just for the console tab right down here. So sometimes I'll tell people like open the gear menu and they're like, which gear menu? So yeah, there's just like 3 like extra menus in this like tiny little space here. I hate it. Anyways. Let's see. Now what I'm going to do is we're going to click on this little button over here. This is the device simulator. It helps me to pretend that I'm viewing this on a mobile device, basically. I'm going to put a little more text in here. Okay, so now I've got an H1 here, takes up most of the width of the screen here. I'm going to turn the device emulator back on. I'm going to set this to iPhone 12 Pro. I think that's the phone I've got. So this is just supposed to simulate running the app, running this website on a phone. There's a few different devices you can choose from, but all this really does is set a screen size. My browser doesn't actually know how these different devices display web pages. My browser just knows what size these screens are. So if I want to test on a screen that is the same size as an iPhone 12 Pro, this is how I can do it. I don't think this is a perfect simulation though. Like, I'm not sure if it distinguishes between click events versus touch events. There might be some other ways that this doesn't perfectly model testing on a mobile device. But so yeah, there's no replacement for actually testing a website on a mobile device if you want to make sure that it's usable to mobile users. But that being said, this can be pretty useful, especially for early testing, or you're trying to do things quickly, don't have time to load it up on a mobile device. So I want to ask people, what do we think about this layout? Like, does this look good? Like, this looks like kind of a normal H1 on a plain website. I can read this pretty easily. It's large text, seems like a heading. But let's all zoom down. So put that to 100% zoom. But what do we think about this text size? Does this seem appropriate? It seems much smaller, doesn't it? And can you imagine, like, if I was actually looking at this on a phone and I had it maybe like a couple of feet away from my face, like I would have to put this right up to my nose in order to read the text. And this is an H1. So what if there's like a paragraph underneath it? So again, on a normal website, you should be able to read this text just fine. But when I go to the device simulator, it is illegible. It's way too small. So I'm expecting that nobody knows why this is the case. This is kind of a weird responsive problem that we're going to have to understand and deal with. So what we need here is actually a meta tag. So we mentioned briefly before that there are extra tags that you can put in the head, these meta tags that add extra information about the page. We're going to need one of those now. But let me just describe this problem here to you real quick. So like, why is it so much smaller on a mobile device? Why does it look unusable? So there are historical reasons for this. So imagine, way back when, at the dawn of smartphones, when those were first being invented, we only had desktop computers. So maybe a typical screen size was like 800 by 600 pixels. And then smartphones were invented with much smaller screens, but people had not yet invented mobile websites because there weren't that many smartphones out. People weren't thinking about making websites for phones. They were just making websites the way they'd always done it. And so basically no websites were responsive, looked good on phones. And so the solution at the time was that phones would basically like lie to websites about how big their screen was. Like the phone would say like, oh yeah, this screen is definitely not 400 pixels by 300 pixels. It's definitely 800 pixels by 600 pixels. I can totally render a full-size website. And then it just scales everything down automatically. So to reiterate, your phone like knows intuitively, well, not intuitively, your phone knows that it's much smaller than a regular screen. So by default, when it loads a web page, it just scales everything down so that it'll fit on the screen. And then the user can zoom in, you know, pinch to zoom, and then you can pan around. So technically the website is accessible, but it's a really kind of clumsy experience. Users would rather just have the text be a reasonable size to read on a phone. So we need to add a meta tag in order to control this behavior. So I, never remember the syntax for this tag. So I'm just going to Google it. CSS tricks comes up first because they're great. And this is the pretty common syntax here. So meta tag, we're describing the viewport. That's, the window. How big should the content be? So the width is the same as the width of the device. So saying, use the full width of the phone, not any wider. Initial scale is 1. So don't zoom in the content, or I'm sorry, don't scale the content down. It should be regular 100% size. So if you want your website to just behave normally on a mobile device and just prevent all these automatic behaviors, this is the meta tag that you want. So let's just drop that in here. Now I will refresh the page, and that looks so much better. So all I did was add that meta tag in saying, don't scale the content, just stop doing all those automatic behaviors you're going to do. And then that gets the content to render much more reasonably on a mobile device. So now I can swap back and forth between the mobile device simulator and the regular view, and you can see the text is the same font size. It doesn't get scaled when I swap back and forth. I don't know why it zooms out every time though, by default. It's kind of weird. There's a few other things you can do with the responsive meta tag. It has some other properties. So, we only set the device width, or wait a second. No, we set width. No, we set content. Oh, these are values of content. Okay, so it's weird because we've got like some key value pairs inside of key value pairs. Content is a key, but the value is itself a key value pair of width and device width. So the syntax gets a little weird, but these are other things that you can change here by setting the content. I just wanted to point out, you can change user scalable, whether the user is allowed to zoom in or not. And I would strongly discourage you from ever setting this. Just leave it at the default value. Let the user pinch to zoom if they want to. Some people who are, designers who are very particular about their designs, they say like, no, I've built the best design. It looks perfect just the way it is. No one else should be zooming in or messing it up. But inevitably, some users are going to have phones with fuzzy screens, or they have poor vision. And so some people are going to need to zoom in on your website in order to read it. So ideally, you should not prevent people from doing
We had a good question in the chat.
What's up?
Daniel's asking, is font size relative to screen size?
No, it's not. But it can be if you want it to be. I'll show you a way that we could do that. But honestly, I would probably recommend against doing that, because that means that like every time you wiggle the width of the page even a little bit, all of the fonts are going to change, and that's maybe a little bit disorienting. What you would probably rather do is like keep the font at a fixed size until like it really just doesn't make sense. Like as the screen gets smaller, at some point you're going to say like, okay, the font is just too big, and then you're going to drop it down like 6 points or whatever, and then let that be the size for until your next breakpoint. So like you're probably going to have maybe 4 different breakpoints with 4 different font sizes instead of having the font size be fluid. But you could if you wanted it to be. Do we have other
Yeah,
questions?
sorry, I was thinking on like on the case of you want like one part of the website to change and the other not. Like for some reason, I don't know why you would do that, but like some text to scale with the width and some text not.
Oh yeah, you can totally do that on a case-by-case basis. You just add classes to things and style them by classes.
Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, there's also those like instead of using pixels, like I think it's EM and REM, and I always get confused by those, to be honest, but I know those can be relative to something.
That's actually the very next topic in today's lecture.
Yeah.
Now we're going to learn about responsive units.
Daniel, you're just ahead of the curve. Or Danielle, excuse me.
Pardon?
Oh, sorry, nothing. I was just making a bad joke.
These are my favorite kinds of jokes. Okay, so one way to make a design that works at different screen sizes is to avoid using fixed units like pixel and instead use responsive units. So the most basic responsive unit is %. I imagine many of you have encountered this. So even though it's the most basic or common, it's actually not the simplest one. So usually 1% in CSS means 1% of the parent. So especially for like height and width, if you set an element to be 50%, it's going to be 50% of the width of its parent. So this can make styling a little bit tricky for one thing, because if that parent changes, that means that your child also changes. Sometimes that's exactly what you want, but it also can just make it harder to change things in isolation, because if everything is scaled in percentages, that means that changing the size of one item is going to change the size of all of its children. Also, in some cases, percentage doesn't refer to the parent. So in some cases, like using transform, percentage refers to the element itself. There are some specific situations, like I actually probably won't show you how to center things with position absolute, because nowadays you would probably just prefer to use Flexbox for that. But it used to be that the only reliable way to center things in CSS was using position absolute with also using transform. But that solution always looked really ugly to me because it uses percentages in two places, but in one place, it's a percentage of a parent, and in the other case, it's percentage of the element itself. So the fact that like this one set of styles on one element has two different percentage measurements, but they're relative to different elements, I find kind of unintuitive. So I just, I know CSS and I've written that exact solution like dozens of times. So I understand what the percentages refer to, but I would totally understand if it's surprising to someone else who is less familiar with CSS. So yeah, percentages are pretty common. Not my preferred responsive unit. What I would recommend instead is VH, VW. We'll just define these first. So this is a view height and a view width. So 1 VH is equal to 1% of the screen's height, of the view's height. It doesn't matter what it's a parent of or a child of, where it is in your HTML hierarchy. All that matters is the height of the window or the width of the window for VW. So in many ways, VH, VW are very easy to reason about. So let's have an annoying pop-up. I want to make sure that this covers most of the screen, no matter how big the screen is. So first, I'm going to link in my CSS file. Style my annoying pop-up. Position fixed. And then width is 8 W. And height is 80 VH. Oh, also some background color. Make it extra annoying. Oh, what's everyone's favorite CSS color?
Purple.
Cyan.
Hollywood.
Heard purple first, so we're going with. Burlywood's definitely a great choice though, one of my favorites. Let's take this guy off. All right, so now we can see this annoying pop-up is right in the middle of the screen, super big. If I make my dev tools smaller, to get myself more screen space, nope, this pop-up is gonna keep popping up. It's gonna fill all the available space. Well, not all of it. It's gonna fill 80% of the available vertical space. Similarly, I can squeeze it in on the right side and it'll get smaller. So there's always that 20% space available. But if I make it bigger again, it's going to expand to fill up 80% of the horizontal space. And kind of similarly, there's vmin, which is 1% of the height or width, whichever is smaller. And vmax is just the opposite. 1% of the height or width, whichever is larger. So I don't use these last two quite as often as VH and VW, but they can be useful. So kind of one little trivial problem I can think of is, let's say I want to make a circle in HTML and I want it to stay on the page. I want to make sure that the entire circle fits in the page and never clips off, but it also needs to be a circle. So I'm going to change my annoying pop-up here. Let's say border radius. Did my browser just crash? What's going on here? Or no, okay. I don't know why they didn't come up when I clicked on it. Anyways. Okay, so I've got an oval here, but it's not going to be a circle because the height is relative to the view height and the width is relative to the view width. They need to be the same. I could make them both based on the view width. So now this will be a circle, but I can't guarantee that it's going to stay inside of the screen. So, here just toggling the width, when it gets too wide, it clips out of the bottom. I can change the height. Actually, no, I can't. That's also going to be a problem. So what I'm going to do is, instead of using VW, it's going to be 80 Vmax. No, Vmin. So the height and width will be the same, so we should get a circle, but they scale based on the smallest edge of the screen. So here, the width is the biggest dimension. So as I continue increasing the width, it no longer increases the size of the circle because there isn't enough height for it to expand. Similarly, when I make the width really small, let's comment those out for a second. They're just taking up space. So when the width is really small, now we can see that it accommodates the vertical space. It gets smaller and bigger, but when it gets too long, it stops getting bigger because we don't have enough horizontal space for it to expand. So I've never been asked to do this, but if someone did ask me to do this, create a circle that dynamically expands to the size of the page without clipping outside of it, you can do that with Vmax or Vmin, I'm sorry. Jake?
Is the meta tag like interacting with the VH and VW, or are those like completely separate?
It's not interacting with the VH and VW. So I can use VH and VWs without the meta tag, use the meta tag with just fixed pixel units. They're independent, but we'll want to combine both of them to make our website responsive in as many ways as possible.
Oh.
All right. Do we have any questions about VH and VW before we move on to other responsive units?
I just want to throw in that the sort of like proportional, like that Vmin example is awesome. Like things where like one thing's size or position depends on another and you kind of want them in like a good proportion or ratio, I feel like is like a concept that comes up a lot, like in building like layouts and stuff. The good news being, especially with Bootstrap, most of that work is done for us.
Yeah. Bootstrap is definitely going to save us a lot of effort.
So I actually wanted to ask about that. I hadn't heard of Bootstrap before joining this course. Is it more often that we're going to be writing like vanilla, like if we get a front end job, for example, is it more often that we'll be writing like just like vanilla CSS or using something like Bootstrap?
You will be using some sort of framework for any professional job where you're writing front-end code.
Yeah.
Bootstrap is the most popular front-end CSS framework, I should say. I don't think I've actually used another CSS framework for any of my front-end jobs, in part because I've gotten to choose Bootstrap a couple of times, but there are other popular CSS frameworks as well. I think I've heard of like Tailwind is a thing people use. Material Design is some like Google CSS framework. But Twitter Bootstrap is definitely the most common, most popular. In my opinion, it's the best and easiest to use as well. But what is definitely not common is using no CSS framework. It's very important to me that you all understand the rules of CSS and know what the difference is between CSS vanilla and using a framework, so you understand, appreciate what the framework is providing you. But practically speaking, no one is going to write professional CSS without a framework.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, like most places you go to will have chosen a framework that they use. You know, maybe there's some company out there, or if it's a big company, or if they have a special case where they've essentially written their own framework and have a bunch of custom CSS, or like are doing like using a framework and using some of their own stuff. So there are situations where you might have to like mess with CSS more, but it's always going to be in the context of like I don't think anyone, if they were doing a project, well, if you're doing like a homepage from scratch, maybe for your homepage you don't want to use a Bootstrap framework. But if someone like hired me tomorrow to do something, I would probably just use Bootstrap.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so just like I promised, we're going to talk about ems and rems now, two other responsive units. These ones are specifically used for sizing fonts. Now you can use them for anything that has dimensions, a height or a width, but most commonly these are used for fonts. So an em lets you size an element relative to that element's parent's font size. In case you're wondering why this is called ems, it's supposedly this term comes from like print typography, like magazines and books or whatever. An M is supposed to be like the letter M. It's like how tall the letter M was that was used as some standardized unit of measurement. I don't know. Just historical little tidbit for you. So let's you size an element relative to its parent size. So let's see that real quick. So first of all, I'm going to set a base font size. On the HTML element itself. So this is the parent element that contains all of the other children in my document. I'm going to set a font size, 16 pixels. And then we're going to style, we called it .msize was the name of my class, right? Yeah, msize. And this is going to have font size 2 ems. Let me get rid of this giant circle, giant annoying pop-up. Okay, wow, amazing. Let's inspect that. Try to understand why it looks the way it does. Does not seem to be getting the style. What did I do wrong here?
It's EM, not EMS.
Oh my gosh. Thank you. So you might have even noticed a difference just as I refresh the page. This wow is now much larger. How much larger is it, do we think? Okay, well, spoilers, it is twice as large because I've set the font size to 2 M's. So that means it's twice the size of its parent. So let's play around in our inspector for just a minute more. HTML, font size 16 pixels. M size has font size of 2 M's, which is overriding 16 pixels inherited from the HTML element. But if I want to know actually how big is it, like in pixels, I can go to the computed tab here. And so this is going to tell me actually how many pixels that is. So 16 base font size times 2, because it's the parent is 2 M's, gives me 32 pixels. So this is problematic for a couple of reasons. The first issue is similar to the problem with percentages, just that I'm styling an element based on its parent. So this makes my HTML more rigid. It's harder to move things around, because if I move one element into a different parent, then that parent might have a different font size, and that's going to cause the child to render its font differently. But another issue is when we have nested content that's all sized in M's. So let's take a look here inside of our M size div and add another. Then okay, so let's make some predictions. So we already saw that this wow was 32 pixels, right? How big do we think this wow is going to be?
64.
64.
Okay, it seems like a reasonable guess. What about this one?
128.
Okay. How about this one?
256.
Yeah, you guys can multiply by 2. So yeah, here's the problem. And I'll look at it actually. So yeah, each one is twice the size of the one above it, because M's are always relative to the parent element. So, you know, this wow is 2 M's inside of the HTML element with font size of 16 pixels, so it's 32 pixels. But this wow is 2 M's inside of something that is 32 pixels font size, so it's 64 pixels. So every time we nest an element inside of an element where everything is sized in M's, it is again doubling our font size. So this becomes very difficult to reason about. We have to keep in mind the entire structure of our HTML in order to know how big any one thing is. That's no way to write code. Nobody wants to do that. So there is another unit that I think is preferable to EMS called REMS. This stands for a root M. This lets you size an element relative to the HTML element's font size. This is much easier to reason about because there's only one HTML element. And so you can move other elements around the page and their font size isn't going to change because it's not relative to the parent, it's just relative to the HTML element. So if I change this class here from M size to use my recently created rem size class, I said, oh, right, I need to change all of these. Okay, so now they're all the same size because this guy is no longer relative to this guy who is not relative to this guy to this guy. All four of these are just relative to the HTML element, which has font size of 16 pixels. So each of these should be 32 pixels in font size. Much easier to reason about. So my simple recommendation is if you need to have dynamic font size throughout your application, it is much easier to size things with rems and then set some base font size in your HTML. And then maybe this changes based on various criteria, or you can let the user change the font size in the HTML element. So that's really useful for lots of like news applications. They let the user set the font size for the HTML element, and then everything else is sized in rems. So you can control like the global font scale, basically.
Yeah, I was thinking about newspapers and online magazines actually with when we were getting to M's and Rems about like places that care a lot about their typography.
Yep, absolutely.
So you're saying you want to avoid trying to hard code in your font size for each thing, just kind of have a baseline page and then
Yeah.
scale everything off that?
Because inevitably what's going to happen is like some designer is going to come in and look at what you built and be like, this is great, I love it. But you need to make everything just a hair bigger, just 1 pixel, just not a big deal. But of course, if you have separate individual font sizes for everything, then you're updating all those individual font sizes. And it's a chore to make sure that you do it correctly, that you don't miss anything, that everything is updated proportionally, whatever. If you just have one root font size for the HTML element and then scale everything based on that, it's really easy to just globally change the size of the website if you need to. And also for responsiveness, it makes it easy, you know, for smaller screens to change all the font on your website by simply changing the font size for the HTML element. You don't actually have to rewrite all of your font sizes. So yeah, I would recommend you size your font in rems and just forget that ems exist in CSS. These are not helpful.
Yeah, and for like, you know, if you imagine like the New York Times, like they're gonna care a lot about, it's mostly text, but they're gonna care a lot about the visual layout of that text, and like what Raphael was saying about designers and like the proportionality of the size of one thing to another, and that's why like rems probably get used in that situation and stuff too.
So can you use decimals in the rems if you want a smaller size than the HTML element?
For sure.
It's 10%.
Wait, what the heck did I just do?
So it's multiplicative.
Right. Oh, and I commented all these out accidentally. Okay, my comment shortcut is not working for me for some reason. What is, okay. Got 1.1 rounds. So yeah, this is now 17.6 pixels. This just, I need to point out though that you can't actually split a pixel. Like your screen is a physical device. It has a large number of individual pixels. They're either on or off. There's some specific color. You can't size an element to be half a pixel tall. So CSS is still doing that math because, you know, the HTML element, oops, says 16 pixels. And then this rem is 1.1 of that. So 110% of 16 pixels, I guess is 17.6. But it's not going to render 0.6 of a pixel. So like, it's going to either round it up or round it down, depending on like exactly how big it is. But just be aware that if you are like sizing your layout in fractional pixels, you might get weird situations where things don't line up perfectly because it like rounds up in one place and rounds down in another. Yeah, I've definitely like worked with designers who were like the super type A, very particular, very specific kinds of type, but just not very technical. And they would just like ask me to do designs in all these like fractional pixels. And I try to explain like, no one's going to see this on their screen. Like, this is only meaningful to you. So yeah, don't get too hung up about half a pixel. What other questions do we have about responsive units?
If you don't set the HTML like font size, what's the default?
Doesn't it depend on the browser?
It
It's
does.
16 pixels.
That doesn't seem right. All right, styles. Why isn't this show all? I guess it's 16 pixels. I don't know why I thought it was like 12 or 14 or something. Anyway, as far as I can tell, that seems to be the case. Any other questions about responsive units?
Wait, so if you make a fractional rem, it will produce a fractional font size?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I kind of zoned out for a second. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Usually that
Interesting.
shouldn't matter, but just don't design a layout such that you're expecting fractional sizes and depend on that to be meaningful, because it's going to get rounded when it's displayed.
That's what I figured. Okay.
Yeah, you cannot split pixels. All right, so we've been chatting for a while now. I think we're about ready to take a break. Do people have any last minute questions before we take a break? When we come back, we'll be talking about Flexbox. Questions?
I thought I read that there was something beyond Flexbox, like
What do you
kind
mean
of
by
replaced
beyond?
Flexbox.
And there's lots of stuff out there. but Flexbox is particularly useful. And so I'm choosing it to teach it to you in the limited time we have. There's certainly lots of stuff that I'm choosing not to teach you because I just don't think it's as helpful.
Oh, fair enough, I understand.
Was there something in particular that you wanted me to comment on?
No, I was just curious. I thought I'd read in passing a sentence or something that said something had replaced Flexbox, and I wasn't sure how that works, but that's probably just preference and functionality, so it doesn't really matter.
Were you reading about grid?
I don't know. I can't say. I've gone through so much content in the past 2 days.
Sure. I would say nothing has replaced Flexbox, really. Flexbox is still in the process of replacing other things. It's the latest and greatest thing to come to CSS, and I love it, and I'll be happy to show it to you all after the break.
Agreed. Flexbox is awesome, especially relative to like right before Flexbox.
Yeah, it's really just such a breath of fresh air if you've been writing CSS before that. All right, so if there are no more questions on responsive units, let's take a break now. It's about 10:35. Let's come back at 10:45, and we're going to talk about Flexbox. Let's continue as we were. All right, so during the break, I did a little bit of work, created a container here, just a div with a class on it, and then created a div inside of it. It's a box, has content. Apparently it's not a box. All right, so I put border radius on it. So we got a circle. I don't like this black background. What's our second favorite CSS color?
Cyan.
Great color. Make this guy a little bit bigger so the content actually fits. Okay, you know what? We're not going to make this a circle. Cool. So we've got a square. There's some content in it. So let's say we wanted to have a bunch of these guys and actually have them line up in a row.
Hey, Raphael,
Yep.
would you mind if I show you some squares I put together, and maybe you could show us how to create that?
Maybe. Do you want to show me what you're talking about?
Yeah. So I created this, okay, because one of the things I was really getting confused on is I was thinking, okay, I need to wrap these two black ones together because I want them centered next to each other. And then, okay, I want all of these pink ones to be centered within this one black one. So now I've got a container for that one. Okay, and then I want these two pink ones to line up next to each other. So I want a container for that one. And then I want these three to all be centered within that one pink one. So now I need a container for that one. So I started getting really confused when it came to Flexbox as far as, can something be a parent and a child and at the same time? And if that's the case, which one would just say flex and which one would justify and which one would be, which one would have those properties or so that was my confusion, was can it be a parent and a child, or do you have to create another just div parent that doesn't have anything else? Or yeah, so there's my problem set here.
Yeah, so it should be okay to have a flex child that is itself a flex container for more children. That gets into slightly more complicated layouts, but it should be totally valid. And, of course, if you have trouble doing that for any reason and you need to add an extra div and that makes it easier, by all means, go for it. But generally, I'd say that this layout that you're trying to achieve would probably be easier to do with Bootstrap. So towards the end of this lecture, I'll be showing us how to use Bootstrap and how we can pretty easily build something like this. You could also do this with Flexbox, but it would be a little bit more involved.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw in, I think like, I see that there's almost like two pieces to what you were sharing, Alicia. There's like, how do I do like a 2-column layout, like the 2 black columns? And then how do you do the layout, the more complex layout within the 1 column where it's like multiple pieces? And sorry, I'm going on a tangent. Just again, like I think tackling all this stuff, like breaking it down into like smaller pieces and steps. And I'm kind of segueing and we can chat more during the break and stuff. Sorry, Raphael. I thought I had a point and then it veered.
Good. All right, let's look at my screen again. So let's get some more boxes in here. Okay, so as is usual in HTML, these are all stacked up vertically because they are display block. I haven't changed their styling at all. But let's say that's not what I want. I want them all neatly in a row. So there are a few ways I can get this line up horizontally. I can use display inline block and then set margins and padding in order to make it all line up neatly. But there is a simpler, more efficient way to do this using Flexbox. So first, I just want to clarify what Flexbox is for. This is a newer display type, wasn't originally around. It's a new option aside from block, inline, or inline block. And specifically, Flexbox is used for solving one-dimensional layout problems. So if you're trying to line up elements in a row or in a column, and you have some particular needs about how that gets done, Flexbox might be useful for you. What it is not for is solving two-dimensional layout problems. So like Alicia, the problem that you showed us, that would require either like many Flexboxes or maybe using grid, or honestly best would be using Bootstrap or some kind of other CSS framework.
I mean, I just want to point out that was pretty similar to a LinkedIn layout. So just throwing that out there.
Well, we wanted you to do it the hard way first time around. So in my opinion, grid is not very useful to us as web developers. Grid is useful for like framework developers, like the people who wrote Twitter Bootstrap. They probably have a good handle on CSS grid and then used it to write Bootstrap. But we're not going to be thinking about that too hard. We're just going to use the classes that Bootstrap provides in our own code. Whereas in contrast, Flexbox is actually very useful for the kinds of problems that we're going to be solving as developers. So even working on top of Bootstrap already, Flexbox is going to be very useful to us. So in order to actually use Flexbox, the first step is you go to Google, type in how do I use Flexbox?
Totally.
And then you go to this CSS tricks article, which like no joke, every time I use Flexbox, I start by going to this article. It's really great. It has a kind of visual explanation of all the different rules. But generally speaking, in order to use Flexbox, there are two different parts of it. There's a Flex container, and then there are Flex children. So for the most part, we're actually only going to be setting styles on the Flex container, and then that's going to dictate how its children are centered inside of it. There are some special cases though, where you'll want one child to behave differently than the other children. And that's when we'll use properties for the children flex items. So this left column here is properties for the parent container. Those are more commonly used. Like anytime you use Flexbox, you're going to need to add some style to the parent container. And then these on the right are a little bit less commonly used. I've used Flexbox maybe a dozen times in my career, and I've had to add properties to the children maybe once or twice. So that's not something you need every time. It's only if like one of the children is an exception. But so anyways, showing us here, in order to use Flexbox, first thing we set display flex. So that changes the layout. It's no longer a block level element or inline block. It is a display flex element. And then because it's a flex container, there are all these other properties that we can use now in order to change how the document flows. So normally when you put a bunch of HTML elements on the page, they'll either stack up vertically if they're block level, or stack up from left to right if they are inline block. But we can change that by saying they should be a row or a column, or a backwards row or a backwards column. We can change the wrapping behavior, because normally inline block elements, when we fill up the top row, it starts filling in the next row. So actually exactly what is showed in this image here. But we can change that so that instead elements don't wrap when there's too many to fit on a row, or maybe we want them to wrap in the opposite direction. So kind of like a snake, where instead of always starting over from the left side, we stay on the same side and then just move back and forth. Okay, so justify content. This is the really good one. Like 90% of the time when I'm using Flexbox, it's because I want to justify content, and I'm either using space between, space around, or space evenly, most likely. Flex start, this is the default behavior for like inline block elements, just everything goes to the left. But if we want something to be different, we can use one of these properties. So I'm going to add display flex to my container. I called it class equals container. So I set display flex, and then immediately you can see that they're lining up in a row, but it's still not like super pretty. There's all this extra space on the right that is not being used. So I'm going to add another flex style. So here, justify content. I want one of these space settings. So justify content, and then I'll fiddle with it in the inspector. I don't know. So I just set it to justify content center. So now it's all in the center, which is kind of neat, I guess. But it's not as much fun as some of these other properties. So I'm just going to scroll through here and flex end. Some of these are very similar. I can't tell the difference between these two. Flex start. Okay,
so whenever you're doing these, oh, sorry.
So space around, this is where we get to like the very useful ones. It centers everything with space between them. But importantly, there is equal space on the left and right side of every box. So that also means that there's twice as much space in between boxes as there is on the edges, because there's only one box to create space here. Whereas over here, there's space from this left box and then space away from the right box. So that is very similar to space between, which has space between the boxes, but just not on the edges. And then space evenly, which has the same amount of space between each box as also between each box and the edge. So they're pretty similar, space around, space between, space evenly. What they have in common is that these would be kind of a pain in the butt to do without using Flexbox. So it's really useful having these. Was there a question?
Yeah, just asking, that accounts for all the margin and all like the box characteristics or whatever, whenever it's spacing out, right? Everything is accounted for in that.
Should.
And also, if you wanted to like overlap stuff a little bit, how would you do that with the flex? Because it seems like it kind of like butts them up against each other. Can you like overlap elements or anything like that? Or would it have to be a new division?
You mean like with position relative or something? Like kind of the point of Flexbox is to avoid elements overlapping each other so that everything is spaced out neatly.
Because I just see some web pages where it's kind of like things like slide over each other and stuff like that. And I was wondering if that's like a Flexbox thing for that kind of thing.
Probably not, but maybe if you could post an example in Slack, we could check it out later.
All right, I'll try to find something. Thank you.
Yep. So yeah, that's space around, space between. Ooh, excuse me. By far, I think this is the most useful aspect of Flexbox, but there's other stuff too. Align items is maybe useful. By default, everything is aligned like flex start. So if some items are taller than others, they just kind of hang down like an upside down bar chart. Sometimes you actually want to build a bar chart, so that would be flex end. But center can also be pretty useful. And also just figure if you weren't using Flexbox, this style center would be very hard to achieve. Well, it would be hard, and the CSS would look kind of ugly.
I think Francisco had a question.
Francisco, what's up?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. So if you make two divisions, for example, the LinkedIn that we did yesterday, you would make two divisions, one with the search bar, one with the logo, and then the other division holding the other stuff that's on the top of Nav Bar, and then use Flex, and then justify content, space around, and then that would put them aside instead of messing with all the margin stuff, correct?
Yeah, that'd work.
Okay, thank you.
So all these Flexbox properties on the left column, they're great if all of our Flex children should be styled exactly the same way. So currently that's the case. These are all exactly the same generic content box. And so they're all spaced out exactly the same. But if I wanted things to be spaced out a little bit differently, there are some properties for children. So see, the only one I've used here is Flex Grow. The idea is that you're making a dynamic web page. The elements should change size on larger screen sizes, but not all of them. So we can say, like in this diagram here, this is showing that the elements on the side are going to be smaller, but the element in the middle is potentially small. But if the screen gets wider, then this middle element should expand up to twice its original size in order to use that extra space. The elements on the side will not grow at all, but the one in the middle will expand up to twice its original size. So let's see if I can actually get that working. Okay. So now because my screen is big enough, this one box is, it's actually a little bit bigger than I was expecting it to be. But still the point is that that middle box will expand, based on the screen size. It'll get smaller if there is not enough space.
Yeah, this is like miraculous for the pre-Flexbox world.
for sure. It would take a lot of code to accomplish this without using Flexbox.
Yeah, I'm sorry to keep being like, we went to school uphill the snow both ways. But yeah, I just wanted to point that out. And the context helps too, because I think it's confusing, like learning this stuff, because a lot of the time something doesn't make sense, and then it makes sense when you get the context of what it was like before or the history behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a large part of why I talk so much about historical context, especially with CSS. Because so much stuff in CSS just doesn't really make sense. And if you're learning it for the first time in 2022, you're like, why are there so many CSS properties and why are some of them so weird? And it's because, you know, CSS was originally designed for changing the font style in text documents, and it's kind of evolved to what it is today, where we're using it to move, you know, screens around in applications. And also people are like adding new styles or new properties to CSS over the years. So people find that there's a bad way of doing something, then we'll add a new CSS property. Now there's a better way of doing something, but it also means that there's now two ways of doing something. Because it is very rare that anything is ever removed from CSS. Like I showed you the marquee tag, which was probably deprecated in like the early 2000s or something. And it's still like in browsers, like you can still use it. So it is a very slow process to actually get things removed from CSS.
Yeah, totally. That's a really good point. And like a good metaphor for thinking about how things like CSS and technology and like software technologies in general evolve is definitely like the organic one. Like evolve is the right word. It's like, you know, try something and it fails, so we have to tweak it, but there are millions of people that might now be depending on this, so we can't get rid of it. And like the evolutionary metaphor is really good, and it applies for really big code bases too. Like I've heard gardening as a metaphor for working on like big code bases too, where it's like you're planting stuff, but you have to weed and do things like that. And I thought that was great. I think like the gardening organic metaphor and then also like the carpentry metaphor are two really good metaphors for thinking about software.
Yeah, definitely. I love metaphors.
Yeah, me too.
Wish I was a better carpenter though. Jake?
Me too.
So is Flexbox just the term for elements that have the display of flex? Like, are you ever actually typing in Flexbox into a CSS file?
No. So there's no like box anywhere in here. Like the name of this technology is Flexbox, but the actual CSS rule that we use in order to use Flexbox is just called flex.
Just display flex and then it's Flexbox. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Nathan?
Is Flexbox like in pretty much every browser, right? Or something like that? I think I read somewhere that it's kind of like inherently in every single browser now or something like that.
Nowadays it is.
Okay, so you don't have to worry about like compatibility too much with it.
I mean, as long as you don't have any users with out-of-date Opera mobile phones, then you should be good.
Okay, that's good. Sweet, thank you.
What other questions have we got?
Yeah, I have a question. I think I've already figured it out, but center versus baseline, what's the difference? I think baseline just aligns the boxes to the text. I think it's further down. Yeah, so center versus baseline, does it just align by the text itself?
I guess that's what it looks like it's doing. So it's not based on the height of the element, but just the bottom of the text. Which is interesting. I've never used it before. I can imagine though that if this is what you need to do, have different elements of different sizes at different positions, but have the text line up, this would probably be very hard to do without Flexbox. So if that's what you need to do, it's great, the options there. Justin?
Can you like pull up some sort of website example and then kind of visually show like where Flexbox elements would be used? Like where would you draw the line between using Flexbox to set up architecture for your page and then using other strategies for content?
I mean,
beyond a certain
honestly,
point, you know what I mean?
I just look at these pictures here and ask myself, like, does this look like the thing that I'm trying to build? And if it is, then I'll use it. And if it's not, then I'll do something else.
You can go pretty deep down with Flexbox too. Sorry, Raphael, I didn't mean to interrupt.
You can. I haven't in my past. I've used just pretty basic applications of Flexbox and but still found it incredibly useful. So the most common reason why I would reach for Flexbox is because I'm trying to center things. I'm trying to achieve this basically. And it's hard to do that writing manual CSS. And so justify content, space around is a very useful thing for me.
For sure. And I meant, I apologize. I didn't mean deep as in complexity. I meant as in like the diagram that Alicia shared is a perfect example. You use Flexbox for 2 big columns, and then for ordering columns and rows inside your columns, you might use more Flexbox. And so you can, layer it and use it for a lot of layout stuff. I think it depends on the situation, but it definitely does, I think, get used that way often.
Yeah, you could do that. If I wasn't using Bootstrap, I would probably end up doing what you're describing, just using a lot more Flexbox to set up the rows and columns.
Yeah, and somewhere in there, I'm sure Bootstrap uses Flexbox.
I expect so, yeah.
Yeah, Dalton, it's a good question about like kind of getting a good feel how to use this. Yeah, I think you just have to, I think once you folks start building a couple like simple sites with Flexbox, you'll start to get a better feel for it. I think it'll help a lot.
So this kind of takes like div elements that we've specified the size of and made like 5 of them and clumps them together and allows us to rearrange them accordingly.
Yep.
It's an organization tool for what we already know for creating divs and elements of a particular size, I guess. Okay.
Yeah, and there's a graphic design element a little bit to this. Like you don't really have to go that deep into it, but like when people think about how to design pages, like you're thinking in like a 2-column layout or like a grid pattern, and Bootstrap gives you the tools to do all this stuff. So I think, starting with, all right, what do I want my web page layout to look at, like, and kind of like drawing it out. Again, like simple, visual, rectangular. And then I think that's kind of a good starting point to like using Flexbox to build that, if that makes any sense. And I don't know what your thoughts are, Raphael, if you feel like that's sort of on the right track or like tangential or not, kind of like you might have a better way of kind of how to think about this stuff.
Sounds about right to me.
John, did you have a question, or was the hand from before?
No, I got a question. So Flexbox is used for solving one-dimensional layout problems, but I see like stuff happening in 2 dimensions here. So can you explain the difference between that and Bootstrap and how, or what they mean, what you mean by one-dimensional versus 2-dimensional in this context?
So I mean, like here, Flex Wrap, I'm considering this a one-dimensional layout problem because we just have one row of content. Like it's going to visually render on another row, but in a sense, there's just one line of things. Like these might all just be list items in a single unordered list or something. And like, what are you saying? So for here, for like align items, there's some verticality to this, but we're still mostly just dealing with one row of items and how they get aligned. Whereas like with grid, you're pretty much always dealing with 2 dimensions, like rows and columns simultaneously. So grid is not really appropriate for solving these like smaller kinds of problems.
All right, thank you.
Do we have other questions about Flexbox, or can we move on?
How is the use of Flexbox, how is that viewed in by employers?
Favorably. I don't think it's a big deal either way, but if you mention that you used Flexbox to build some layout, they might think it was neat. Just you're kind of in touch with modern CSS.
Yeah. Do you think that if you say to an employer, like, I'm comfortable working with CSS, that they assume Flexbox knowledge? I'm not sure, to be honest.
I don't think they assume Flexbox specifically, but they assume that one way or another, you're familiar with enough tools in CSS that given a JPEG, you can make a website that looks like it. So maybe you learned CSS 10 years ago, and so you know how to do everything without Flexbox. Great. But yeah, if you say you know CSS, I just assume it means that you can get stuff done.
Yeah, that's a good call. Yeah, I might err a little on the other side, but I think you're right. And Maya, I think that like I would encourage everyone to add Flexbox to the list of things of I want to feel comfortable enough with it so that if I had to do stuff with it, I could.
So would you put something like that actually on your resume, or that's just kind of implied with the whole CSS thing?
Honestly, as a junior developer, I might put it because when you're starting out, you know, you don't have kind of work experience to fill it up. But then like once I got experience, I think I wouldn't. It's kind of, at least in the startup world, there's like this weird inverse relationship with like how much, like the shorter the resume, like the best resume is to say, I worked on YouTube at Google as a software engineer. And then that's all you need to say, right? But that's like a platonic ideal of a software engineer resume. And I think like you can kind of see it if you looked on people's LinkedIn's, like the more experience they get, the less they tend to describe stuff. So I think it would make sense to add it there, starting out for sure. Yeah, and I'm curious what your thoughts are, Raphael, because again, this is just my own take on things.
Yeah, it sounds pretty consistent with my experience.
And those are great questions, by the way.
Yeah, loving all the questions. I do want to get to media queries though before it's too late. So let's talk about that for a minute. So showing you a lot of good techniques today for, you know, making your website respond to different screen sizes, be more adaptive. But sometimes these are not going to be enough, and you're going to have to break out the big guns. That's how I like to think of media queries. It's definitely a little bit more work to use media queries than some of these other techniques I showed you, but this is definitely the most flexible option you have. So a media query is basically like an if statement for CSS. It lets you describe a condition, and then if that condition is met, you apply a completely new set of styles to your website. All right, so let's get an example of that. So here in this page I've been building, we've got a little bit of text on the screen, but when the page gets too small, we can't fit it all in one line. It's got a wrap around. So I don't really like that. I would like it if the text got smaller at a certain breakpoint. When we're no longer able to fit all the text on the screen, we should make the text smaller. So here at like 1140, it just barely fits. About like 1120, that's when it gets cut off. So let's say at like 1130, I'm going to have a breakpoint. So the way I do that is in my CSS file. At the very bottom, I'm going to write my media queries. And I'm deliberately putting these at the bottom so that they will override other styles that are above them, because I want to think of these as being an exception. These are more specific in my mind. So I'm going to say at media. This is how you start a media query. And the parentheses, you describe the condition. Most commonly, you're going to style based on max width. And then in some curly braces, you can just put any other styles you want. So I'm going to style the HTML element, set font size to, it's by default, 16 pixels, set it to 14 pixels. Or, I mean, yeah, that's right. Okay, so now when the screen is at 1160 pixels, we've got our big text, just barely fits on the screen. And then as soon as we reach this breakpoint at 1130 pixels, the text gets smaller. But now as we continue squeezing the screen in, as we get below like 990, again, it's getting a little bit tight. And then we're going to have to wrap our text around. So I'm going to add another media query. Dalton, do you have a question?
Yeah, are breakpoints just called media queries, or those two separate things?
They're related ideas. A breakpoint is just a width in pixels, at which point the layout changes. Media queries are one way that you can enforce breakpoints or create breakpoints. Media queries can do other things, like I can choose to style based on something other than the max width. So for example, you can use media queries to distinguish between printers and screens. So like if someone's going to print out a web page, you know, as if this is like MapQuest in 2006, they don't need to see your nav bar. They just need to see the main content of the page. So maybe you would have a media query that hides the nav bar for printers. But most commonly, your media queries are going to be used to create breakpoints.
Cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So here, this one's got a max width of 990 pixels. Again, we're going to style the HTML element, give it font size 13 pixels. So this way, when the screen is less than 990 pixels, we get to apply these styles. Now, of course, when the screen is less than 990 pixels, it's also less than 1130 pixels. So really both of these styles are applying, but it's just that because this one is written below this one, then this one is going to take effect. So the order actually matters here. All right, so here we're at just under 1,000 pixels. When we get under 990, you can see the font size jumps down yet again to, again, you know, accommodate our layout becoming a little bit smaller. And like I was saying, these have to be in this order of descending screen size. I did it the other way, it doesn't work. Oops. So at this breakpoint, we've got big text. Where's the first one? 11:30. Okay, so now this breakpoint is applied because the width is less than 1130 pixels. But then as we get smaller, because we get less than 990 pixels, nothing happens to the font size. It doesn't get smaller at this point. Because even though the width is less than 990 pixels, it's also less than 1130 pixels. And so this is taking priority just because it's further down in the same CSS file. So order matters. I'm doing this in descending widths.
Raphael, we had a good question in the chat about if you wanted to have like more than one condition in the media rule, like in addition to max width or something other than max width. And I'm actually Googling it now, but I'm not 100%.
I've seen something like this. Yeah.
Yeah, I found it in the MDN too. I was just
Let's go there.
Yeah, I threw it in the Zoom chat if you want to grab it from there. But there's actually, it says combining multiple types or features somewhere in there.
So yeah, this is totally a thing you can do. Something should be at least 30 ems, and also you're in landscape orientation. You can style it like that. I've seen people do stuff like this on like web apps or like maybe mobile games or whatever. If it's intended to be played in a landscape orientation, then you can have a media query checking your orientation. And when it's in portrait mode, you can just hide the game and then display a pop-up message being like, hey, you need to put your phone in landscape mode in order to play this game. And then they turn the phone sideways and everything works properly.
That's a great example. Yeah, like if you were making a really artsy website, that would be something cool to do. Max width is definitely the most common.
Yeah, by far.
And I just want to throw in most of my professional experience. We used like media queries for breakpoints like a lot, and not a lot of things like percents or like relative things, maybe some REM, but mostly pixels. So media queries and breakpoints are super useful.
They're definitely very useful. I think of media queries as being kind of laborious. Just like styling a website like you were describing is like a bit of effort. Just, you know, the process of taking the browser full screen and then slowly making it smaller, seeing when the layout breaks at what screen width, and then you make a breakpoint for that size and then change the styles so it looks good at that size. And then you continue, you know, making it smaller until it breaks again. So that's definitely a reliable way to build a responsive website. And you can certainly make any non-responsive website look good on mobile by, you know, refactoring it in that way steadily over time. But if the website wasn't built originally to be responsive, you might end up with a lot of media queries, which that's fine, it works. But I would like to believe that if you're more foresighted and you knew upfront that you were trying to make your website like responsive, there are probably ways that you can leverage like REMs, VH and VWs, and Flexbox so that you are less dependent on media queries. I'm not saying that you're going to get away without using any of them at all, but I just think of these as being like a heavier solution. So I tend to reach for, these other things first. Responsive units, Flexbox, before I reach for media queries.
You're totally right. And I think, and we never did a lot of media queries because it also, there's a little bit of processing that the browser has to do to calculate stuff. It was always sort of like for differentiating, there were like three, it was like full screen, tablet, and phone, and we'd have like a media query for each. And this was for an application with like a search box and a lot of interactivity that had a decent amount of users. And then there was also Flexbox, and there probably was REM used as well. And also there was a lot of historical baggage in the code base. So you're totally right, Raphael. One trick at that job that my manager taught me, who was good at this, is he would change the position of dev tools to be on the side, and then increase or decrease the size of the dev tools, so you don't have to, like, instead of moving the whole browser to the left or the right, it's in the three-dot menu. Yeah, if you put it on the right, and then if you resize that, that's how you can do it, because he had to deal with this code base and do this stuff all day. So that's cool. And you're totally right about using things in combination, and that media queries are a heavy tool, and that like Flexbox and these other tools should be used. Yeah, the main thing really was like laptop versus phone.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like too many media queries when you put it that way.
Yeah, I should have rephrased. Like, yeah, there were like, we didn't have more than 4, but it was really useful because there's like, depending on what the needs are of the organization and the business you're working for, there's a bunch of stuff that might have to happen if you're looking at a phone versus a laptop, or different screen sizes. Like, it's like whether it's text size or a pop-up to encourage someone to download the mobile app, which can be annoying, but if you're working at a for-profit business, is probably going to be there. So it ends up being the case that like there can be a lot of differences that add up for like a product between the way a web app looks like on the computer and for a phone, how it looks and behaves.
Yeah, for sure. We just saw a few hands going up. I didn't see the names though.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, like when we were looking at LinkedIn and closing the window, certain elements of the page were just going away or rescaling. So it looks like that would be one of these kind of media things where you'd have like you'd point to a certain container and you'd say display none upon reaching this. And then because you built the rest of the object that it was sitting in off of rems or dynamically, it would then collapse onto itself and kind of reorganize in a way, I imagine.
So at 990 pixels, P is going to have display none.
Okay.
So it's gone. And now it's there.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, definitely super common.
All right.
What other questions have we got?
So even while being responsive for planning, would you establish the breaking points to be kind of like the standard sizes of monitor ratios, like a 16:9 or anything like that, or a 16:10? Would that be smart so that like the majority of users have exactly seen what you want them to see? And then for the whatever other ratios that kind of between it, there's like an in between that can still work, but the best optimal experience for each one you kind of like establish with those ratios or something? Can you do that?
So there are a few different ways you can go about this. I've never thought of coming up with my own breakpoints because I basically always use Bootstrap for professional projects, and Bootstrap has its own predefined breakpoints. XS, SM, M, L, XL, XXL. Oh yeah, they're right here. So these are the specific width breakpoints that I use because I'm always using Bootstrap.
Those are all resolution based.
What do you mean?
I mean, resolutions are typically that kind of.
Oh
wide.
yeah, yeah, like 768 is a 1200.
Those are typical breakpoints for most resolutions.
Yeah, assuming you've got your browser window full screen.
Yeah, 1080 is not there. Kind of weird. Yeah.
Yeah, 1080 is definitely the one I'd expect out of any, but whatever.
It would make sense that it wouldn't be there if that were the default, though. If 1080 is your default, you'd have breakpoints beyond that and below that. So that's probably why it's not, because 1080 is most common.
Oh.
Everything shows at 1080. That's what it seems like to me. Strange.
I don't know. Before we get to Bootstrap, though, actually, do people have any more questions about media queries? No? Okay, so let's actually talk about Bootstrap now. So Bootstrap is a very popular CSS framework, which is essentially just a bunch of class selectors with predefined CSS rules. So there's a few reasons why we use Bootstrap. So for one thing, Bootstrap provides normalization. So we mentioned this before, but different browsers have different default settings for different elements. Bootstrap is going to apply sensible defaults to every element. So also nice features is it to build responsive So internally, Bootstrap uses a variety of media queries and relative units. You don't have to think about the media queries when you're writing Bootstrap, but those are used internally in order to make your designs kind of more responsive by default. Probably my favorite part of Bootstrap, though, helps you build your layout using the grid system. So Bootstrap comes with a grid system, helps you set up columns for your web application. It's really easy to use. I love it. And so I'm going to show it to you right now. So first thing we're going to need is a link tag. I'm going to put this above my style sheet. So I want this loaded in first. So where is this coming from? Let's Google for it. And go for the Bootstrap CDN. For those of us who don't know, a CDN is a content delivery network. It's basically a network of servers that just exist for you to download specific files from. So in this case, The Twitter folks wanted Bootstrap to be available for developers to download. But if it was just like on one server that they had, then people who are close to that server can download it very quickly. People on the other side of the world, they have to wait a little bit longer. And moreover, just when the server gets really busy, it might take a longer time to download what you need. So the idea of a CDN is it's this distributed network all around the world, so that there are multiple websites, multiple servers that can serve Bootstrap to you in case one of them is unusually busy, but they're geographically distributed so that no matter where in the country or maybe where in the world you are, there should be a Bootstrap CDN server that is relatively close to you, with the goal just being that you should be able to download Bootstrap as fast as possible. So right now I just need this CSS link. Oh, how delightful. They even give me a full link tag. Just click it to copy.
Yeah, CDNs are a really common part of the architecture of modern web apps. And that was a great description. I threw a link into the resources channel as well. It's actually from the Cloudflare website, and they're one of the really big companies that provide CDNs as a service to other companies or whoever wants to use them.
Yep. All right, so I've loaded Bootstrap. Let's go back to my page. All right, so already you should notice some changes just when I refresh the page. So the margin around the page has disappeared. There's no more of that default margin on the body, and the font has changed because Bootstrap sets default values for fonts and margins. Everything that I didn't set explicitly, it is setting some value for it so that nothing is left unspecified. But now where the real fun comes in is using the grid system. So in order to create a grid in Bootstrap, Dalton, you have a question?
So Bootstrap is setting a default value for your font. Is it ignoring the font value you set in the main CSS?
I don't think I set a font. Yeah, there's a font size, but I didn't say if it was like Arial or Helvetica or whatever. Cool. There isn't a font family.
Yep.
So we can actually inspect this if we want. Some kind of variable going on here. Bootstrap body font family. So this is defined somewhere. Let's see, computed. System UI as the default, and then Apple System or Sego UI. I don't know. So that's the list of fonts that Bootstrap is trying to use, I guess, by default, if I don't set it to something else.
But so had you set a font though, it would have used the font you set besides Bootstrap's font?
Right. Just because my style sheet comes after Bootstrap's.
Cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's also possible my styles would be higher specificity and they would override for that reason. But like if Bootstrap has a selector that's the same specificity as mine, which is the situation I'm concerned about, then I would want my selector to be afterwards so that it takes priority. All right, so we've got a div here. This is going to contain my grid, so I have to give it a class.
I just want to clarify, so far all you've done is you've just put the Bootstrap CDN link in your metadata, that's it?
Yep, I had the link tag in my head for Bootstrap, so that loads Bootstrap style sheet. So that does apply some styles to H1s and paragraphs and other common HTML elements. But I have not yet used any of Bootstrap's classes.
Okay, so you wouldn't, if you were using Bootstrap, you also wouldn't link like say a normalizer or anything like that?
Correct. Bootstrap includes normalize in it.
Yeah, there's a ton. That's a really good question. There's a ton in that style sheet. And for future reference, the .min you see in there stands for minimized, which just means that it's like compressed in various ways to be smaller, which we'll talk about more later, but is also common for apps.
Yeah, this is Minified CSS in case anyone's curious. It's just all on one line.
Yeah.
Taking out all the white space in order to save a few bytes over the network.
All the variable names get replaced with like letters and numbers to be as short as possible, and it's super incomprehensible.
Yep. Okay, so first things first, our grid needs to be inside of a container. We have to give it the class container. That's a Bootstrap class. I know I used that word before here, but now I'm actually using Bootstrap. This is the name Bootstrap expects. Then inside, we're going to create a row. And then in the row, we can make some columns. Now in Bootstrap's grid system, we always have to have 12 columns, or at least the widths of the columns must add up to 12. So we can have we've got 2 columns now. This left column is 4 columns wide, and the right one is 8 columns wide. Maybe there's a better way we can visualize this. What? Oh my gosh. I'm sorry. So I still have these styles here, just incidentally applied to something with the same name. I'm going to change this real quick. My box container. Box container. Okay. So the just regular container, this is my Bootstrap container. Okay, let's try this again. Okay, so this is a little more what I was hoping to see. I'm going to add some more styles, make this a little easier to visualize. So now we can see our columns a little bit more clearly. The left column is half the size of the right column because I set that to be 4 out of 8 or 4 out of 12, and the right one is 8 out of 12. And so as long as it adds up to 12, then this content, it's going to fit in one row. Rows always have 12 columns. That's the point. Now, where things get more interesting, as I was saying that Bootstrap is a responsive framework, it uses breakpoints, is that we can set screen sizes for these columns. So it's not always 4 and 8, but only at specific screen sizes. Excuse me. So I'll say column small 4. This is column small 8. So at small screen sizes, this first one is 4 columns and the second one is 8 columns. And let's say we'll add another column class here. So now this is saying that on medium-sized screens, we're kind of flipping our layout around. On medium-sized screens, the left column is 8 columns wide, and the right column is 4 columns wide. So, pardon?
Could you set something as 0 then if you want it to disappear on like a small screen?
No, there are other Bootstrap classes that you can use to say that it disappears at certain screen sizes. But for the columns themselves, these are just numbers 1 through 12. Oh yeah, so you can set display to none based on certain sizes. So that's how you would remove it based on the screen size. Yeah. All right, so let's look at it go. So left column is big, right column is small. As I move screen out. Oh, wait, did I do it the wrong way? Okay, yeah, so as the screen gets smaller, then the left column gets small, and now the right column is the bigger one. There's also just general breakpoints in Bootstrap that made everything smaller. Hang on. So yeah, the whole thing is smaller at small screens than it is at big screens, but also the relative proportion of the left column to the right column changes when we cross this breakpoint from medium to small. And then once we get from small to extra small, because I've not specified any column classes, they just stack on top of each other vertically. And this is generally what you want, honestly. When your screen is that small, you just can't really have sidebars or multiple columns. So it's very common for extra small screens, you just collapse everything vertically like this. I saw a hand up, was that Nathan?
Yeah, just I might have missed it, but just something real quick. So another reason that we don't need, or the main reason that we don't need to learn grid at all is because the Bootstrap kind of does it for us and more intelligently, right? To get the same behavior would take a lot more like time and effort of us using grid than just using Bootstrap, which kind of like deals with all the nuances, right?
Right. Like you could recreate this grid system using CSS grid, but that would be a lot of work. And in general, I think that using Bootstrap's grid that is provided to you is significantly easier than using CSS grid. But it solves basically the same problem.
Totally. Yeah, and the history is interesting because Bootstrap was one of the first like front-end CSS frameworks out there before Flexbox, before CSS grid. And they, you know, I don't know if they popularized, but they had a grid layout that they built using the existing tools at the time. So for a while, that was like one of the only ways to do a grid. So that was around before CSS grid. And like Raphael was saying, you want to use it because you can do a grid with it, plus it gives you a lot more.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's explore a little more. So we've found that we can, whatchamacallit? So we can change the relative widths at different screen sizes. So that's super useful to not just scale everything down for smaller screens, but maybe some content needs to get scaled down and some content doesn't. So you can control that. Sometimes, now I just said that these need to always add up to 12, but it's actually perfectly valid in Bootstrap to have more than 12 as long as you understand that it's just going to wrap around. So let's say we want to have multiple rows. Let's go for, oh, that's not quite right. There we go. or no, actually, small 4, medium 4, small 3. No, other way around. Small 4, medium 3. Okay. And we've got a whole bunch of these. I know it says left column, just ignore that. Okay, so now it goes neatly into 4 rows with 3 items in each row. So right now we're on a small screen. So this div is going to take up 4 columns. And if it's 4 columns wide out of 12, we can fit 3 of them in a row. So these 3 guys are going to fit on 1 row. 4, 4, 4 adds up to 12. This next guy is going to have to go onto another row. So that's why we're getting this kind of row behavior here. But then when we increase the size of the screen a little bit more past this breakpoint, now we have 3 rows of 4 instead. Because now at medium screens, these guys are only 3 columns wide, so we can fit 4 of them in a row. So they kind of wrap around a little bit differently. So I've definitely done stuff like this for like showcases. I'm trying to think of what the right word is. I don't know. You just have like a grid of things that you want to show people. And you're not really sure if you want 3 in a row or 4 in a row. And so I've done like really this exact thing a couple of times where you have 3 in a row at small screens, 4 in a row at medium screens, and then I don't know, maybe 6 in a row at very large screens, but I don't usually get that far. So that's pretty cool. Not a lot of people know you can do that with Bootstrap. I think it's a really nifty technique.
Can you show your CSS code related to that one more time?
There's none. I've just put the border on the div just so we can see what's going on. But this is all from the previous demos. Really, all of the work is being done just by these classes. So the Bootstrap folks have already written most of the CSS that I need, and they've defined these classes for me. So I can just apply these classes to my HTML. So that's something that I hope all of us will appreciate about using Bootstrap is it dramatically reduces the amount of CSS you have to write by hand.
Yeah, it does everything. Normalization, there was a great question about like responsiveness. It does that. It has like built-in breakpoints. And a lot of that stuff has become standard. Yeah, we're still using CSS. It just becomes a lot easier. And it's still really important to understand how this works because as soon as you start moving beyond like a pretty straightforward layout, you know, stuff comes up and you have to know how it works to make it look the way you want. And Raphael, I know we're reaching the end of the lesson. I know a lot of people had layout related questions earlier that I feel like this is answering, and I just wanted to encourage people to ask questions related to layout, to that stuff, as long as it's a good time for that. Raphael.
Yeah, we can talk about layout. There's just a little bit more about the grid I wanted to show people.
Yeah, for sure. That's why I wanted to check in with you.
So one last demo here about the grid. I just want you to know that you can have nested rows. So I've got my row up here with 2 columns that somehow or another are going to add up to 12. But if I want to further organize my page, I can have columns, rows inside of my columns. Another div class equals row. I'm gonna do something strange for no reason. So inside of this other row, it's going to have 2 columns that still add up to 12. So that's important to point out. is that even though this is a smaller column inside of a column, these still need to add up to 12. So you might think that like, oh, maybe on medium screens, this is 4 columns wide. So these 2 sub columns need to add up to 4, but that's not how Bootstrap works. Inside of any row, the columns always need to add up to 12. It's not like a fixed number of columns in a particular row. It's always out of 12. Which is convenient because 12 is a very divisible number by lots of other numbers. So there are lots of ways that you can split up your columns. Okay. So yeah, here we're on a medium-sized screen. So this left column, is that right? Yeah, we're on a medium-sized screen. So this left column is 8 wide. Oops. And the right one is 4 wide. But then we're still splitting that right column in half, where the left column is a little bit smaller than the right subcolumn. And that's what this looks like. So definitely for more complex layouts, you're going to need to put rows inside of your columns. But once you understand this in Bootstrap, I feel like it's very powerful and you can build like basically any layout relatively easily. I mean, any like common web layout. I'm sure you could find something creative that would be hard to build. Dalton?
Yeah, I just don't. So like when because you made so many, I don't understand what it's doing. Like, could you just make like where it says column small 4 and then column mid 8, but could you also make what would happen if you just made a column small 12? Like because there was a bunch of rows, but I don't understand what's actually making the rows, because at no point does it seem like you're actually making a row.
Are you talking about the previous example where I had like a couple?
Yeah,
of
when you had like a
boxes?
whole bunch of them coming down, and I just don't understand how that happened.
So in that case, there was only one Bootstrap row. It was just this row. But I know that if the columns in a Bootstrap row add up to more than 12, that it wraps around. So I was leveraging that behavior because I wanted it to wrap sometimes 3 to a row and sometimes 4 to a row. And so that's how you can accomplish that if you're not exactly sure like which items are going to be in which row. But a little bit more commonly, you do know which items are in which row. And so this is kind of like that more common kind of layout where I'm going to specify exactly how many, I'm going to make sure every row adds up to exactly 12, basically, because I'm not expecting any kind of wrapping behavior. And so I'm also using these div class rows for the sub rows inside of my like larger row. So yeah, a couple of different techniques, a few different ways to use Bootstrap. Hope that's not confusing.
So could you add on to them, if that makes sense? Like, are you going to be filling out these rows with like user data, or do you, I don't even know how to word what I'm trying to ask this.
I mean, yeah, they'd have user data or some kind of useful information in them somehow. Not just like left sub column, but there would be dynamic text probably from the database or something.
Cool, thank you.
What other questions have we got?
So how does Bootstrap, like, let's say it gives you a default font or whatever for it to be, what happens if like you override that font size and now it's too big to allow for that class's size? Will it automatically shrink your text and say, sorry, the layout class that you selected overrides the font that you selected? Or how does that work?
I mean, like it's all just CSS. So if you write your own style that overwrites like something that's in Bootstrap, then like you've overridden it. It's going to look how you want it to instead of how Bootstrap thinks it should look.
And I think you can, like in your own CSS, I think you could change the font family, like what the font looks like. And if you just change that without dealing with font size, and then Bootstrap's font size rules would still apply, I think.
Okay, and then are we, is this basically going to be the extent of what we cover for Bootstrap? Or because Adam had mentioned that you can use Bootstrap for like font and other things aside from just layout. Are we just as a class going to just cover using it for layout or?
I mean, by far the most important aspect of Bootstrap is the grid system. Like if that was all it was, I would use Bootstrap still. And if it didn't have the grid system, I would probably use a different CSS framework. Normalization is cool too. The responsive aids are useful. I'm going to show you in just a minute that Bootstrap also provides some JavaScript components, which are a bit different from what we've been talking about so far, but they are very cool and they're part of Bootstrap, so I'm going to talk about them. I'm sorry, what was your original question?
So it was basically just is layout kind of the extent of what we're going to cover as a class.
Basically, yeah. I don't have too much more to teach you about Bootstrap, I guess.
And how much in our own careers is that the main thing that we would really want to know it? Or is there like, hey, this is what we're covering in class, but oh, by the way, when you actually go to use this out in your own career, you're also going to want to go and research how to use it for this, and this.
I don't think it's going to be as much research as you're anticipating. The grid system is definitely like the most complex part of Bootstrap. Like just in terms of like learning how to use it. The other things here are much simpler. Like, so where are the buttons at?
Yeah, I was about to say, looking at some like components and like some of the visual things.
So yeah, Bootstrap has styles for buttons. You start with the BTN class, and then you add, BTN primary makes it look like that color. BTN secondary is that color or whatever. But maybe you decide that you like most of this styling. I like the slightly rounded corners. I like the white text. I like the hover style here, but I don't like this exact shade of green. I want a slightly greener green for my success button, and I want a redder red for my danger button. So I could write my own CSS style that just selects BTN primary, or let's say BTN success, and then overrides just the color. So then the other settings, like the border radius and the size, margin paddings, that's still being applied by Bootstrap, but I have just overridden the color for BTN success. So I can continue using the Bootstrap classes and all their semantics, but it's gonna fit the unique individual style of my website's color theme.
Yeah, and like the claps or the carousel components, the claps might be a good one to show how Bootstrap like sort of combines the JavaScript and the CSS and things to just do stuff that you could create, but it just does it really well and handles edge cases and makes life easier.
Yeah, for sure. We're going to see that in just a second.
Awesome. Oh, cool.
So actually, let's see that right now. So I mentioned before that Bootstrap is just a CSS style sheet. So that's mostly true. There is also JavaScript that is optionally included in Bootstrap. If you want to use the components in Bootstrap, you have to get the JavaScript too. So I'm going to just grab that HTML. Cool. I think we want to defer this. Or no, actually, we definitely don't want to do that. Okay, so I'm not actually going to do anything in this page. I don't know why I bother refreshing, but I just want to show you that in order to use the JavaScript features, I have to add their script tag into my head. But that gives me access to all of these wonderful components that Bootstrap provides. Some of these are more useful than others. I'm just going to show you my favorites. So first of all, by far, my favorite Bootstrap component, this is the one I use most commonly, is the Nav Bar. Some of you may have discovered that building a Nav Bar is kind of a huge pain. There are a lot of like really finicky bits involved. It's just a lot harder than you might expect. So Bootstrap provides a really just rock solid Nav Bar component. It'll space out your links in a pretty way. There are a couple different variants of it in case you want a search bar or you want it on the left or the right or whatever. So you can look through all of the different options they have here. And find a nav bar that looks good to you and then copy and paste it into your code. Or you can even kind of combine some of these styles. Bootstrap is pretty flexible. If you find elements of one example that you want to combine with elements of another example, you can probably like mix and match the markup to make a nav bar that looks however you want. So Bootstrap is very flexible, definitely, in how you combine these styles together. Yeah, it's especially great because A, it makes it really easy to put in drop-down menus like so. This is kind of a pain to code it yourself, but Bootstrap just has this ready to go for you. By far the best part though, oh, didn't mean to click on that.
Yeah, I forgot how great this component is. And it's a great example of like, yeah, you could do it yourself, but why would you want to when this exists?
Yeah, this is saving you so much work. Okay, so the best part about the Bootstrap nav bar is this auto hamburger menu. So we saw, in LinkedIn, how they keep adjusting the nav bar as it gets smaller and smaller to make it accessible still. Bootstrap takes a simpler approach. When it gets to the point where not everything fits in the nav bar, it just turns into this button, which gives you this little hamburger menu. And even like the drop-down menus turn into nested drop-down menus, so they're still accessible. It's not the prettiest thing, but it does guarantee that your nav bar is accessible to mobile users, and no matter like how many icons you got in it. So that is super useful and definitely a big pain to do that manually yourself. So I really appreciate Bootstrap providing that to me.
And I just want to throw in quickly, there's no magic to the Bootstrap nav bar. Like, I encourage everyone to go look at the source code for the Bootstrap nav bar at some point. There might be a lot of layers to it, which might be a little tricky to understand. But like, if you dig down, it's just going to be all this stuff that we've been talking about with CSS and JavaScript and HTML. And definitely like, as much as you can. It's harder earlier in your career, but some of the best advice I got was to not be afraid of source code for libraries. And I think that's really valuable. Like, again, especially starting out, it's tough, but give it a look and don't be afraid to look at the source and poke at stuff. And there's no magic. It's all the same. It's built with all the same tools.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of developers, I think, are too hesitant to look at the source code, but it's certainly a fantastic learning opportunity. Sometimes it's your only option, honestly, to figure out how something works in particularly dire situations.
Yeah, and sometimes the documentation is wrong.
Yeah.
Jacob has a question, by the way. There might have been, I know John had a question. I wasn't sure if it got there.
I'm wondering, are we going to be using frameworks within frameworks? Like, will we use Bootstrap within React or Angular?
I'd say we're using both of them alongside each other. I wouldn't describe it as a framework inside of a framework, but yeah, we'll be using Bootstrap to handle the styling of our front end, while React is handling the interactivity and page routing and stuff like that.
That's the stack. So I know people were talking about stacks. We were talking about stacks the other day.
Yeah. I don't usually include my CSS framework as part of my stack, but you certainly could if that was something you're proud of, that you've put a lot of effort into becoming a good CSS developer, then you might include whatever framework you use as part of your stack when people ask you.
Bootstrap is just a CSS framework, right? It doesn't deal with any like anything that I guess Angular or React would
Correct.
Do. Okay.
It does have JavaScript components that we're showing you here, but it would be very misleading to call Bootstrap a JavaScript framework. This is considered a CSS framework. Oh yeah, so I was showing you some other components here. These are just things that I've used professionally and found very useful. The collapse is just if you need to have target or content that is only visible sometimes. There are other ways that you can show and hide things, but this is pretty, I think. Gets you a little animation, which I appreciate. And there's, flexible ways that you can make it work. You can have it work by clicking buttons or by just like calling JavaScript functions. So there's a lot of ways you can make it work. It's flexible. And then if you have multiple collapses, that's basically just an accordion. So these are just different collapsible sections. But in an accordion, opening, it's multiple connected collapses, but opening one closes the others. But you can also have it not work that way. So here is an accordion where multiple things can be opened at the same time. These are pretty commonly used in like FAQs, and I really can't think of any other situation, honestly, but I don't know, they're useful for FAQs. What else we got? These alerts are super simple. It's just a colored box with text in it. For some reason, I see these very commonly on lots of websites. The buttons are also nothing special, but it's nice just having this like terminology predefined, primary, secondary, success, danger, warning. So you can think about what you're trying to communicate to the user. Is this like a primary action or a secondary action, or just kind of like going to show you an info box? And then you can use a semantic button accordingly. Was there a question?
Hey, I have a question really fast about those buttons. You were saying earlier if you wanted to change the color of them. So I know to change color, you refer to class, but what would you actually type it in as? Would it be like .btn then btn as well? Like, because there's a space between btn and then btn button.
Right, so it's got two different classes. Let's just look at a button. Okay, so this is a Bootstrap button. Amazing. We'll inspect it. So the class BTN, this is the generic button class. This has a bunch of styles that are applying to all the buttons. Doesn't have any color information. BTN success, this is just colors for the text, the background, and the border. So if I want to change the color, I only have to target this one class, BTN success, because they didn't use both classes to set the color. They only selected one class to set the color. So in my style sheet, I can say BTN success background color is, I don't know, say it's orange, why not?
Misspelled background.
Great, so now this button is orange. I guess the clicked style is still green, so there's more styling to do. But yeah, so now you can see BTN success, background color is green, but that's struck out. BTN success, background color orange, that's now the most specific, that's taking priority, so that's being applied. This is actually another reason why I really like Bootstrap and why I prefer it over other CSS frameworks, is because the styles in Bootstrap are written with very low specificity. So this color is just coming from a selector with one class in it. So remember what we learned about specificity the other day. Any selector that you write that has two classes, or a class and an element, or a class and an ID, almost any selector is going to be more specific than this. So it's really easy to override Bootstrap styles. 99% of it is just perfect for my needs. But in the occasions where I need to override Bootstrap and change how it functions a little bit, it's really easy to just go in the inspector, see why a Bootstrap element is styled the way it is. So I know what selector I can write to override it. I've never done a full project in other CSS frameworks, but I've struggled helping students that were using, I think like material design, for example, and some other CSS frameworks, because all of these selectors are written with very high specificity. So, maybe IDs and classes, many classes, possibly using bang important. That's like the very worst. If something has bang important in the selector, it's almost impossible to override it. So some other CSS frameworks, maybe they look very pretty when you just load them in and use them with the default settings. But then if there's one little thing that you want to change, well, you can't, because everything has very high specificity. So Bootstrap is very easy to override. It's all very malleable. So I have always enjoyed using Bootstrap. So a couple other things. Just John, what's up?
Yeah, so I'm trying to understand this. When we're using in HTML, we can define ID and classes, and we just use, it's like a variable, right? We use whatever name we want. Is that correct?
Can you say that again?
So when in the HTML page, or the index.html, the file, we use ID and classes as our own identifiers that we could use in CSS, right? So we can name them whatever we want. But in Bootstrap, it comes with predefined classes. Right?
Yeah. And
so
I can still make my own classes if I want to. Just if there's styling work to be done, I'm going to try to do that using a predefined Bootstrap class before I think about writing my own class. And most of the time, that's going to be sufficient.
But because you could define, like name our own classes, so if we're using Bootstrap, we have to just be careful not to use the same name that Bootstrap uses for one if it's predefined classes.
Right. So that was a problem that I just ran into earlier in this demo, where I created, this div here was originally just called container. And then I, did that demo, kind of forgot about it, moved on. And then I loaded Bootstrap in, and then Bootstrap has a class called container. And so that was applying all of its styles to this container here, which was not what I wanted.
Okay. All right.
So yeah, you do have to be aware of the names that Bootstrap uses for its classes and avoid making your own classes with those names, because then they'll get the Bootstrap styles.
Okay. And then, so Bootstrap, when you're using a Bootstrap class, it is not changing or adding to your style sheet, right? It has its own style sheet, like that you don't even see that it's working on. Is that correct?
Yep.
Or does it actually add stuff?
It's this style sheet.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah,
right.
I know this looks like a big ugly tag, but it's really just a link tag that pulls in a style sheet. It's got selectors with CSS rules, pretty similar to this.
Okay. So you never actually see that file. It's there on the
right. I think I showed us the minified version briefly. It was just that one line of CSS going for like miles off the side of the page.
Okay, cool. All right, thank you.
Yeah, and if you want, you can look at the unminified version too. But point is, it's just a CSS file. Let's see, we've got some buttons. So occasionally you'll see multiple buttons that are kind of part of some related choice. Left, right, middle, makes sense for them to be together. Kind of hard to do that, styling it manually. So Bootstrap provides that for you. Carousels are honestly kind of an anti-pattern. People discourage you from using these nowadays. They used to be much more popular on the web, just as a way to display lots of content when you don't actually have a lot of space. So, here there's just one box and we've stuck like 3 images into it that the user can scroll through, or you can set it on a timer so that, it scrolls automatically. But apparently people have done like UX research and have determined that these things are completely useless. So basically the research is that like 98% of your users will never see anything past the first slide. So like don't expect anyone to wait for the slideshow to progress. No one's going to click through. Like these second and third slides might as well not be here. So the only use case I can think of for a carousel, honestly, is if you are like legally required to display a variety of images, but you have strong expectations about which one your users are looking for. So I'm thinking like maybe, so let's think about CDNs again. You know, the Bootstrap CDN.
I didn't know that about carousels. That's cool.
Yeah, I was reading some article last month or something. So Bootstrap lets you, the Bootstrap CDN lets you download Bootstrap. They do actually provide many versions of it. So here they go 5.13 and 4.6.1. Only 2 different versions. There are ways to get the older versions, but maybe one way that you could make these available is in a carousel that just shows the latest version. Because I'm pretty sure that like 99% of my users are going to want to download the latest version. So I'll just put that in page 1 of the carousel. Now, technically, I should make the other versions available. I don't really want people to use the old versions, but technically they're there if you need them. So I would put those in the subsequent pages in the carousel so that they're there if you want to go looking for them, but I'm not like putting it front and center in my webpage. So you're probably never going to encounter that situation. So generally not going to need carousels, but if someone like pays you specifically to build one, like I would use the Bootstrap one instead of building one myself. Danielle?
If you wanna like you did with the button, like personalize your button, like for example, you don't like green and you wanna have your style button, it would be good to have like a database, like your own Bootstrap with the modified code.
I mean, it's basically just a CSS file.
Right, but like your preference, like making your own custom Bootstrap. That's what I'm saying, like modifying the things that you don't like.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, that's basically what my global CSS file would be. So I mentioned before, for every project, I'll have one global.css that has styles that should apply to every element in my website. And much of that is going to be overriding Bootstrap styles. So it's kind of serving as my like update to the framework, sort of. Like a framework specific to my application, more specific than Bootstrap, if that makes sense.
Right, but like, yeah, I'm thinking of like maintaining, for example, a design line with 2 different websites or something like that, like to maintain, I don't know, on all yellow buttons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if you need to maintain consistency across multiple websites, that's a slightly harder problem. But yeah, then you could publish your CSS style sheet as like its own independent project that you pull into your other projects, like through a CDN.
Oh, that's good. Okay.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, you could essentially make your own Bootstrap, basically, for your own company.
Well, I don't think I'll try, but
That's a good question.
Let's see, modal is also a really important one. You've probably seen before where there's like a pop-up that appears on the screen and it like grays out the rest of the screen, so it grabs your attention. It's one of these guys. So you notice I click the button, screen grays out, this thing comes down. There's options, and then it goes away.
Yeah, there was something someone asked about in the last day or two, like when would you use this, and like a modal pop up. Oh, the Z-index, the Z-index. I think that gets used for a modal, but I'm not certain, Raphael.
Yeah, for sure. If you were going to build this by hand, which you could totally do, we could have like assigned this as an exercise, but we didn't. But if you were going to build this by hand, you would probably use Z-index to make sure that, you know, there's this gray background on top of the whole page, and then that there's this text box on top of the gray background. So yeah, Z-index would be important.
CSS Z-index. Yeah, and you're totally right. I didn't think there'd be the 3 layers, like the box on top, behind that a transparent gray background, and then behind that the rest of the page.
There's a lot going on here, honestly, more than meets the eye. Why I really appreciate the Bootstrap modal is because it has very good UX. If you're building this modal yourself, you could probably get it to work 99% of the time, but there would be a lot of edge cases. So for example, it's really easy to accidentally make your website like broken or inaccessible if like we don't remove the gray background. Like I've seen broken modals where you dismiss it and then the screen is still gray.
Like you have to click on the X and clicking on the gray doesn't work. Yeah, that's a really good point.
A lot of modals that I've seen, they will disable click events on anything outside of the modal. So you have to be like yes or no in order to proceed. But sometimes like there's a bug and then the yes or no buttons are broken and then you can't get out of the modal. So by default, the Bootstrap modal will dismiss if you click anywhere outside of it. You can configure that, but the default behavior is to avoid breaking your web page. Also pressing escape dismisses the modal, which is kind of a nice default. I think if a user, doesn't know how to get out of your modal, they might guess pressing the escape key. And so their expectations will be confirmed. That's nice.
Totally. And that's a really good point. And so it's like, for learning, it can be great to build stuff from scratch to learn how stuff works. And if you enjoy it and to get better with the technology. But this is why, like, when working professionally, both in terms of productivity and just all these kinds of edge cases that pop up with UIs that you never think of until you run into it, using like a battle-tested framework like Bootstrap that's been around, that's well-designed, that has all the edge cases handled is really useful because you just get so much stuff. And there's always edge cases with user interface, with UI work or user experience work.
Yeah, most of the work is edge cases, I swear. They got a scrollable modal.
That's awesome.
Huh. I think that's new, actually. I remember for the longest time they had this modal, and I always hated it because I thought it looked dumb. Like it's just way too tall and you have to like scroll down the page. And so I would modify that modal so that it worked like this guy. But it looks like now they've actually got an example of it. So I'm just going to copy paste this instead of building it myself. That's nice.
I think you're right. And that's a great example too. Like people have been asking about like, what's the value of like learning all this stuff, especially if there's frameworks. And I'm simplifying the question, but that's a perfect example of how like you use a framework for the modal, but it doesn't have a scrollable modal. That doesn't exist, but I need it because my boss wants it or it's important or whatever. And so I have to then kind of dig in there and add my own stuff on top of it or in combination. And that's where, like knowing CSS really helps and you're using the core technology and the framework together.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. So that's basically all of my favorite Bootstrap components. I don't think I forgot anything cool here. Yeah, these are all kind of whatever. I guess popovers are kind of neat. So these just kind of little pop-up tooltippy things. And this one even has like a heading. So if, this one just happens on hover, so you don't even need to click on it. So if that's what you need, popovers are pretty nice. I really like them.
Quick question, Raphael.
What's up?
Can we break for lunch sometime soon?
We can do that now. So
thank you.
Thank you everyone for asking questions, being engaged,
excited.
listening, loved it.